All right, we are live and we're going to get started this morning. Thanks for joining us on County Connections webinar at Florida Association of Counties. I'm Eric and am pleased to bring this topic to everyone. It's something that, at least within the environmental realm, is something that we've been wanting to provide and convey to counties on environmental issues related to land application of biosolids. And recently, the Thousand Friends of Florida, located in Tallahassee, has produced a report called Biosolids in Florida, an Assessment and Management of Impacts. And joining us today to present portions of the report, we are joined by President of A Thousand Friends, Paul Owens. We also have with us Craig Diamond, who has long work in environmental advocacy throughout the state of Florida, and Lisa Renneman with St. John's Riverkeeper. So just to get us started, I'm going to ask Paul to talk about the background for this project and how the study was funded, and just a little more information about the initiative.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate the forum today. I appreciate the good work of the Association of Counties and the ICG. A couple of years ago, 1,000 Friends of Florida, which is a land use planning advocacy organization. We're nonprofit and nonpartisan, heard from a foundation called the Sea Grape Foundation that expressed interest in supporting a project to examine an element of water quality in Florida. And we had heard a growing concern through our work from around the state, but especially in the St. Johns River Basin, of the impact of the land application of biosolids on water quality. So we proposed, and the Sea Grape Foundation accepted, a research project that would look in some depth at these issues. We did not have the technical expertise on our staff to take this on, but we got in touch with Craig Diamond and arranged for him to be our research director on this project. Craig had the technical expertise and experience, and Craig was assisted by a research assistant and an academic economist to put together a final report on this issue, which we issued back in June, looking at environmental impacts and exploring some other elements of these community impacts. Also, we have worked over the years with the St. John's Riverkeeper, with Lisa, on issues of common interest, common goals. And I know that Lisa has been interested in this and doing, the Riverkeeper has been doing its own work on this. So there was a nice kind of intersection. They've put out their own report, which Lisa will talk more about today. But those are the two experts for today's presentation, and I'm happy to turn it over to them for their presentation now.
Anything else, Eric, before we get started?
No, let's go ahead and go. Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.
All right, I'm going to attempt to get started with a screen share for the PowerPoint, and do let me know if there's any issues. Okay, great. Welcome, everyone, and we certainly appreciate your attendance this morning. So this is a a current summary of the work alluded to by Paul regarding Thousand Friend Zone work, and that conducted recently by the St. Johns Riverkeeper. So we're going to be talking about biosolids and how we might get to move forward in its management. I found this quote years ago, and it's always stuck in my head as entertaining, but it certainly is apropos to the subject that we're going to be discussing. Society has been in the business, in the biosolids business for thousands of years. And as Paul mentioned, this project was born out of sort of a general understanding that we do produce a lot of waste, primarily in urban areas, as you can see in the blue on the left, and it's being transferred elsewhere, largely to the Upper St. Johns River Basin. We'll be talking in great detail about that this morning. There was concern, again, Paul alluded to this, that there may be some societal considerations involved, environmental justice concerns, and certainly environmental impacts or externalities that aren't being fully addressed by the market, the funding and spending for biosolids management. So the task set by Thousand Friends for me and the research team was to use the most recent data that was available at the time. We got started in 2022, and to use statistics and GIS and any other tools that we might be able to apply to better frame exactly what's going on. So we wanted to look at environment, we wanted to look at social and economic considerations, and to see whether or not what we're doing is in fact optimal for society at large in terms of how we deal with primarily Class B biosolids, but biosolids in general. Okay. Most of you at the county level have some understanding about your own wastewater utilities. On the left here, wastewater, both residential and commercial, goes in, and on the right, effluent and biosolids come out. So hopefully everyone's comfortable with exactly the subject that we're talking about. The solids, the septage, the biosolids are dealt with, or they're treated to varying degrees, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. And they're also disposed of by various means. The utilities, the county's choices in this are largely economic, although each of these choices, whether it's landfilling or land application, what have you, is certainly going to be subject to other regulations, both federal and state. And we'll talk about some of those as well. But these are choices. So we wanted to look at these options and start thinking about what are the impacts or the effects of these choices, and may there be a better balance or an optimal choice at the end of the project. This is a recap. There is more recent information, but these were the images included in the Thousand Friends report. You can see the broader mix at the federal level, but in Florida, our choices are relatively limited. You'll see the reference in the right-hand image referring to Class AEQ. That's the same as Class AA, according to the EPA standards, and you'll see that well more than 50%. And that's 2018, and the numbers continue to grow. We're pushing up to 2/3 of it is in Class AA. Agriculture, so the chart is slightly misleading in that agriculture uses both Class AA and Class B. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. More simply here, you'll just see the three categories of Class B, Class AA, and that which is landfilled. And again, we're looking at about 2/3 of it now being deployed or treated to Class AA levels. This is a snapshot, or this on the next slide is a summary of the scope of work that Paul referred to. Our job was to go look at both all applicable state and federal regs, do a big literature review. We had over 200 sources included in our appendix to take advantage of the most recent information that was out there, because the data on the DEP site was a bit dated, to create a geodatabase to go ahead and support our more technical analysis, to take a look at PFAS, which I know Lisa is going to be talking to you a little more about later this morning, and to do the appropriate analyses that we can to look at those societal justice considerations, water quality impacts, and externalities to the extent that they can be defined. We were also charged at looking at the fundamental cost and benefits that are undertaken by the counties with regard to, what's more cost effective or not. And to the extent that we could, look at a number of non-market considerations in that valuation. And then finally, to come back, such as we're dealing with you all today, to present our findings and to make recommendations to officials and other stakeholders. We don't operate in a vacuum. I referred to both state and federal regulations before. I emphasize that these regulations historically are guided by risk for human exposure. That's what governs it. It's not the environment. It's not societal equity considerations or anything else. The primary drivers are pathogens, bacteria, viruses, etc., and heavy metals, which were an initial concern for their presence in biosolids at the time EPA shifted in treatment and disposal by allowing Class A, Class B, and Class AEQ to occur. I want to emphasize here that, again, the classification, these three levels of treatment, are not guided by anything other than pathogens and heavy metals for concern about human health. They're not based on nutrients or anything like that, that in Florida are probably going to be of greater concern. So they're not part of the regulatory framework. We want to emphasize to you all that Class B biosolids, the ones which are treated to the least level, are in fact monitored by DEP, and their land application does go through a permitting process. So we have information that is current and are apropos to that. However, the larger share of biosolids being distributed through the landscape and being managed by our utilities and the counties are exempt from any nutrient restrictions for land application. Their distribution at this point in time is not monitored. So they're handled completely differently because from the concern of the federal government, the human health risk is not really a factor for them. So the nutrients that we're going to be spending a little more time about this morning aren't really being addressed. As I said, DEP does have permitting for the Class B. Any permit does have to have a nutrient management plan and consideration of the soils to which it is being applied. There are cumulative limits, and there are special provisions for key receiving waters, such as outstanding Florida waters and drinking wells, and consideration also about how Class B biosolids are stored on site until they are in fact land applied. There have been some recent regulations, and we'll talk about these a little further. Back in 2007, the concern about the effects in Lake Okeechobee and eventual downstream pollution of the Everglades led to the Northern Everglades and Estuaries Program. And I will say it's effectively precluded land application of biosolids in the Okeechobee Basin of South Florida. It doesn't utterly exclude it, but the standards for nutrient controls are that rigorous, where effectively no one is doing it any longer, and that is all contributed to the transfer of Class B biosolids. As I mentioned, there are some other areas around the state where they basin management action plans do stipulate a little higher level of control and management. And again, the Everglades was the key driver for this, although there are other sensitive water bodies involved. So as I said, the management plans have to demonstrate that there's no net increase in nutrients to the application sites, and that is difficult to achieve. So again, that's the driver for a lot of the transfers that we're going to talk about. In 2020, the legislature did pass the Clean Waterways Act, and it included legislative intent. I want to emphasize that the intent was to go ahead and protect receiving waters. However, as agriculture is the largest user of biosolids, both Class AA and Class B, this is handled largely through best management practices, which are voluntary. They are required for certain grants and things like that, but there's no stipulation or regulation or active monitoring, say, by the Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services or DEP, for how these BMPs are being carried out in earnest. So I just want to leave that with you. In 2023, as this project had already launched, there was collaboration with a number of other advocates as well. And a grants program was successfully tucked into Section 4030674 that was focused on doing more with Class AA and providing resources for innovative technologies. I want to let you also know that there's been no allocation of money towards the grant program, and therefore no money's been spent to go support that particular intent. So it's out there. It's something we would like to see relied on further, and we'll come back to that when we talk about our recommendations. Lisa just added this morning to our slideshow, and it is very important. DEP did issue a consent order a couple of months back that would have allowed continued non-compliance with the 2020 Clean Waterways Act, and Brevard County is challenging that at this time. Lisa, did you want to add any more detail to this?
No, I just appreciate you for adding this, and good morning, everyone. Basically, DEP did allow the major hauler in the state that brings Class B biosolids from many areas that we'll look at in a minute to the headwaters of the St. Johns, but basically be in non-compliance of the 2020 law until 2027. And so we just want to thank Brevard County for taking this on and challenging this variance that would add more insult to injury at this moment to what we're talking about today.
Thanks. So just to recap that point, again, legislature took action in 2020, and now we're looking at least until 2027 for the areas that are most affected by the intent of the Clean Waterways Act to even potentially come into compliance, depending on how all that turns out. That seems like a long time. No one expected instantaneous results as a consequence of the Clean Waterways Act, but here we are now, 5 years later. And to Lisa's point, we're looking at least to 2027, where we'd begin maybe to see some outcomes of this. So that was part of the imperative for this study, is that the needle probably is deserving to be reconsidered, and additional action may be warranted. This issue isn't going to get any smaller. You know, we've got 23+ million people, population continues to grow. Tourism is equivalent to nearly 2 million residents in terms of their full-time occupancy of the state, and tourism continues to grow. We promote it. So even though DEP's last report back in 2018 summarized the total production of biosolids, we believe, based on the population numbers, and that we really don't change our general per capita production of biosolids, we're looking at about a 1/8 increase. So it's an issue that isn't going away and needs attention. All righty. To get into some of the results of the study itself, highlighted 3 particular counties here out of 10 in sequence in terms of who's producing what. Again, this is the counties that produce more than 1,000 dry tons per year up through 2021. That's where we had stopped with our report when we launched it in 2022. So you'll see that Miami-Dade and Broward are highlighted with the red arrow on the map, followed by Hillsborough counties. I don't want to suggest that these counties are ignoring their problems in any way or their contribution to the problem. All 3 are undertaking a variety of supplemental tertiary activities to both reduce their total production or their export, and to improve its quality. They're undertaking additional composting, they're undertaking additional digestion systems and the like to improve their product. But these are our population centers, and therefore they are going to remain the source of biosolids that the rest of the state gets to deal with. So where does it all go?
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Please go ahead, Eric.
Can you go back to the previous slide? I'm looking at the dark blue.
Yes.
In terms of dry tons. And what sticks out to me is Bay County has the same color as, you know, Martin, Indian River, St. Lucie, and maybe even a little bit of down in Hernando, Pasco. Why? Do you know why that is?
Well, but you'll see on the slide previous, Bay County is listed in this top 10 for those that produce more than 1,000 dry tons. So just based on the coloration.
Yeah, let me restate the question. Bay County is a little bit unique. I mean, it's an urbanizing area up in the Florida Panhandle. You know, most of the growth is around the coastal area. But so I'm just it just kind of sticks out to me that they're producing so much of it.
I can only speak to the data that was received through EPA, the National Biosolids Project, and DEP, and those are the numbers that we've got. So uh, we welcome the question, and if something needs to be go back and re-verify, we'd be keen to go ahead and do that so that no one is left with a misunderstanding as to who's producing product. Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah.
We're going to spend a bit of time today on application sites, but I do want to point out that these counties in particular are those that have areas greater than 5 square miles within the county for application sites led by Osceola and Brevard, and then the following three. So those are the core areas. Total application area is basically 150 square miles in the state, and those counties that have more than 5 square miles are listed here. Osceola County leading the list with basically just under half the total square miles of properties that receive Class B application. If we look at properties with the individual numbers of sites, in this particular case, Polk County actually has got the greatest number of sites at 24, but you'll see they're scattered all over the northern half of the state, and you'll see that the southern half of the state doesn't have any, except for Charlotte County, I guess, has got a couple, but Southeast Florida does not have any application sites. Again, part of the legacy of the 2007 law and the practicality that the areas are urban and there aren't a lot of options to place the material. Now, avoiding getting beyond the issue of the numbers of sites in the area, the real interest that drove a lot of the study was how much of the stuff is going where. And you'll see here that Osceola and Polk received the greatest amount, followed by Brevard County. So Osceola receives a lot of waste.
And Craig, if I could just add here, these are annual numbers. And so
Correct.
this is a significant amount of dry tons every single year.
Yeah, and the cumulative considerations are important ultimately for nutrient management, PFAS considerations and the like as well. But yeah, this is only annual information that we're looking at. Lisa, you want to recap this one, if you would?
Absolutely. And just wanted to drive home this point. If you see the blue outlined area on this map, that's the upper basin of the St. Johns River. And so if you'll notice, there's very little, there's just a smidgen of the facilities that are generating the Class B biosolids that are being transferred and disposed of along the St. Johns River headwaters. So we're very concerned about this because this is imported pollution that didn't generate within the St. Johns River watershed.
Okay, thanks. So again, 2/3 of the facilities generating are passing this resource on into the upper St. Johns. So the county level information is very helpful. It certainly gets us into sort of the demographics and the politics of disposition, but we did really want to understand much more deeply the environmental considerations involved, which hadn't really been looked at in Florida when this project was initiated. So of those watersheds, and you'll see the dots in dark orange and red, just as were highlighted on the last slide that Lisa spoke about. Of those watersheds that receive more than 1,000 dry tons, 83% of them, and this is slightly dated information, are impaired for nutrients, whether nitrogen, phosphorus, or both. Some of these watersheds may well have been impaired prior to the application of biosolids just due to traditional agricultural practices or other land uses there. However, the nexus remains that these are the locations that are receiving biosolids still and are still impaired. To Lisa's point, again, these volumes are being applied annually. Ultimately, there's a cumulative consideration for all of this. So again, I highlighted that Osceola and the Upper St. Johns Basin are effectively flagged by that red arrow. Lisa, you want to chat about this one as well, which is a great graphic?
Absolutely. One of the issues we've had is, we've known that this is a problem, that the land disposal of biocelles is a problem since 2007. 2007 is when the legislature passed the Northern Everglades and Estuaries Protection Program, and they banned this practice, the disposal of Class B biosolids, in the Everglades watershed. That was a good law. The only flaw in the 2007 law, it only banned this practice in the Everglades watershed, and this practice should have been banned throughout the state. At a minimum, we should have at that time tried to figure out a way forward. Right now, we don't have a regulatory process that protects other waterways. So this graph shows you that after the 2007 passage of this law that protected the South Florida areas, there was a grace period till 2013. So they had a time to kind of weave their way out of it until 2013. But right there in 2014, you see a significant shift to biosolids in the St. Johns River watershed. The bars represent the annual nutrients supplied in tons, so a huge uptick in both nitrogen as well as phosphorus. And I do want to flag here, I think we talk about it in another spot, but the upper basin of the St. John's was already impaired. In addition, the middle basin and the lower St. Johns River basin management action plans require a reduction of nutrients in the upper basin to be successful. And as this chart clearly shows you, there's a significant uptick in phosphorus as well as nitrogen due to this unsustainable practice. Craig, do you have anything to add?
No, other than it's quite a visible jump. As you can look at the numbers from, say, 2000 up through 2010, 2012, the phosphorus numbers are well under 500. And after that, they're more than doubled. And you certainly see more than a doubling in the total nitrogen. And again, the research that we focused on dealt specifically with those nutrients because they've got bearing on how the state looks at impaired waters largely. When we're looking at algal blooms and everything else, everyone understands that these nutrients are the critical drivers. So until we get a handle on these, we're going to be in a rough spot in terms of grappling with the outcome of the presence of nutrients in our receiving water bodies.
Well, and I do want to point out it's not surprising that the concentrations within the St. Johns River water quality data is demonstrating a significant uptick. And we're seeing new types of harmful algal blooms break out that are driven by phosphorus, as well as water. It's appearing much more cloudy, where there's actually harmful algal blooms that are floating within the water column, and that's blocking really important light that is undermining fish habitat, as well as submerged aquatic vegetation, which are the kidneys of the St. Johns River. So there's a domino effect that's happening right before our eyes due to this harmful practice, and it's well documented by all the agencies involved.
Okay. If you would continue.
And would say, and this demonstrates that their highest phosphorus concentrations are in Putnam and Flagler, there to the north of the map. That's a very high intensity of our agricultural practice. In the headwaters, it's mostly cattle ranches, and so we haven't seen this high intensity you're seeing there at the bottom of the map of phosphorus until this practice has shifted more than 2/3 of the Class B biosolids produced in the state to that lower area of the St. Johns, which is actually the upper basin or the headwaters. And this is all data from EPA as well as the Water Management District. They're seeing this happen, pretty immediately since this shift to the headwaters of the St. Johns.
And I'd only add that Lisa edited this slide to leave out the one from several years earlier, only because there were some issues in terms of the scaling of colors. So the reader might not have immediately understood it, but these hot spots are in fact hotter than they were a handful of years earlier.
Absolutely.
We just need to go back and kind of fix the color scaling scheme, and the two charts can be presented to make a very clear and convincing argument that things haven't gotten better, they're getting worse.
Absolutely. All the work that we've done today collectively has been focused on nutrient pollution because that is the thing that we're seeing result from this transfer of pollution from the Everglades to the St. Johns River. Another growing concern that's being well documented and being discussed both at the state as well as EPA and other areas is that sewage sludge, the way the chemistry in PFAS and forever chemicals work. These are chemicals that have been around since the 40s and 50s. Unfortunately, you see them in a lot of products we use every day, as well as fireman foam. But the chemistry of these types of chemicals seems to really be attracted by the sewage sludge. So a lot of times when we talk about biosolids or sewage sludge, we think of it as domestic human sewage. But many of the wastewater treatment facilities commingle industrial waste. And so we're seeing a high concentration of PFAS in sewage sludge as well. Both, and these chemicals can cause cancer as well as many other health problems. And this isn't even being addressed in any of the testing that's currently happening or the regulations. So we are seeing areas in Maine as well as in Texas where ranchers are going out of business because they're actually having to euthanize their cattle due to PFAS contamination, and it's contaminating their land as well as their crops and their cattle. So this is not only a health concern, it's an economic concern that could potentially put our farmers and ranchers out of business if something's not done. And while the state has recognized that PFAS is a problem with biosolids, there's no testing program at this time to test for these chemicals before they're put on our farmland throughout the upper St. John's watershed.
Yeah, and I don't add, Lisa noted that it's not just residential wastewater, it's commercial/industrial wastewater, which may be blended, but to the image on the right of the chart here, you'll see these are all domestic products, things, consumables and the like in the home. So homes, even if you didn't have a large commercial or industrial base to your wastewater load, residential discharges still feature a lot of sources for PFAS and other contaminants of emerging concern. Go ahead, Lisa.
And just to underscore this connection, both EPA as well as the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, they have confirmed that biosolids are a known source of these chemicals, but they're still refusing to test the biosolids before they're put on our land. And we think that's very important because that protects our agricultural land, it protects our waters, it protects us all downstream from these sites. And as I mentioned earlier, that in Maine and Texas, there are significant problems with the soils that have been exposed to biosolids, drinking water, cattle, as well as milk that's contaminated at levels that much exceed EPA's human health criteria. So the criteria is out there, we're just not doing the sampling. And the EPA does recommend that states monitor biosolids for PFAS contamination, but as of this date in the state of Florida, we are not monitoring for PFAS in biosolids, and we're spreading it on our farmland.
So EPA did amend PFAS contaminant levels for drinking water, and only got around to prioritizing compounds to be reviewed in biosolids, but there's been no further regulation or reconsideration of standards within the product that we're putting across our landscape.
And I would want to say this area, and this is the upper basin right here of the St. Johns River. It's very there's many sites that are connected to our aquifer. Our aquifer provides 90% of the drinking water in the state of Florida. So there are recharge sites, as well as it's upstream from Brevard County's water supply source in Lake Washington. This is a result of a study of a sampling program that was done by the St. John's Water Management District in 2004, downstream from some of their biosolid sites during a storm event. And it shows that they did find, several of these chemicals, as well as other issues coming from these sites that are resulting from spreading sewage sludge along farmland on the St. Johns.
So you'll see hormones in the list, caffeine, antibiotics, but there's a long list of these forever chemicals that have been documented in Florida. Just to come back to the Thousand Friends report briefly, again, we did look at a lot of census information to delve into the issue of whether or not there are any societal considerations of equity And, when we looked at income, age, vulnerable population, race, we were not able to go ahead and determine that there were any clear social justice or environmental justice considerations at the level that we looked at. Having got past that, we then began to go ahead and spend much more time focusing on water quality. So as alluded to earlier in the slide, dealing with those impaired watersheds, we were able to demonstrate statistically that the likelihood of impairment increases as you increase the level of application. That was an important nexus that we were not aware of when we started the project. As an aside to that, the St. Johns River Water Management District, going back, I guess, starting in maybe 21, 22, and has produced several, journal peer-reviewed reports since then. They've documented that nutrients in receiving waters, surface waters, will spike after rainfall events occurring shortly after application. But that specific nexus with the volume of biosolids being applied was revealed through our statistical work. So we just want to emphasize that the application of Class B biosolids in the landscape does have a substantial impact on the likelihood of water impairment. We found this in a long list of watersheds, even where other multiple uses were potential sources of those same contaminants. So the notion is that the application of biosolids, if nothing else, if it's not the only source, it's an amplifier and a complicator for those other sources, especially in watersheds where we're looking to go ahead and clean them up. We've designated them as impaired. We end up with basin management action plans, the so-called BMAPs, to go ahead and attempt to resolve these. But most often, we're seeing that these land application sites figure prominently, and especially in those areas that are getting over 1,000 tons dry per year, the impairment levels are all very visible. And again, what we did look at those where there were more than 5,000 dry tons, and the statistical nexus was highly significant. As Lisa mentioned earlier, the entire St. Johns River is impaired for nutrients, and that the middle and lower St. Johns depend immediately on key reductions in phosphorus and other components within the upper basin, which is, as we've been pointing out, the target for the dominant share of Class B biosolids applications. Lisa, did you want to add anything to that?
I think it speaks for itself. I mean, and you mentioned it is nitrogen as well as phosphorus, but again, we're spreading 2/3 of the state's Class B biosolids in the upper basin. And the the basin management action plans were written well before this practice shifted that high concentration to the upper basin. And so it's just undermine all the public investment from all the counties in the state downstream from these land application sites.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to talk about the timing of the BMAPs as well as the ongoing commitment of state resources to implement them. We did look at groundwater as well. Did not want to neglect that, but just want you to understand there's a lot more surface water information available to us. There's much less groundwater information in terms of the location of the groundwater information with regard to the location of where wells are, especially vis-a-vis Class B application sites. There is a split among groundwater between the confined aquifers and unconfined aquifers, and not everything is monitored within each of these wells. So, and there's a lot of variability in the quality of the groundwater being sampled. So that creates certain statistical challenges, but we were still able to get some results out of the limited data for groundwater that was available. And just want to emphasize this here. So within confined aquifers, these are the ones that hypothetically have a little more insulation from the effects of surface management activities. You'll see the difference between applied and not applied. Applied meaning that's where Class B biosolids occur versus those watersheds where it's not, for both phosphorus and nitrogen, phosphorus above, nitrogen below, where it's multiple times. It's 2 times plus for phosphorus, and it's 5 times times the concentration in milligrams per liter for total nitrogen. So that raises a significant issue about the relationship between the land application and what may be going on in aquifers either under these sites or immediately adjoining them. Pursuant to the outline that we discussed earlier in terms of the scope of work that we were to look at, we did want to look at the cost and benefits of operating the programs that we have in place. So we highlighted 6 particular options that are in play in Florida when, landfilling we didn't include incineration because it's so small, land application, composting, and the like. And we looked at a number of the direct costs. We looked at capital improvements, O&M, life cycle costs, transportation, certainly for the transfer of the Class B, and even the internal cost to farms for spreading them. We attempted to go ahead and look at a number of indirect costs with regard to the value of nutrient inputs to agriculture, whether there are any changes in landfill capacity or increases in landfill use, depending on the option being looked at. And we looked at a handful of non-market costs. I focused here on shadow price of pollution, some of these sort of indirect measurements of what the impacts might be, whether or not any wells were contaminated. We couldn't find information on that, but we did make the attempt to look at it. But there is information, for example, on greenhouse gases for transportation, from decomposition within landfill, and also from the eventual decomposition from land applied Class B biosolids, and those are measurable, and those have market value or non-market values to which folks have imputed dollar and cents values to them. We also looked at a number of benefits. The technology we'll talk about in particular, the Cedron approach does recover market value ammonia, phosphorus, and even potentially electric revenues from their particular technology. We looked at avoided costs. And we also looked at the non-market benefits, for example, of the improvement of soil organic matter. So that if you're adding composted biosolids or even Class B, that's a substitute for actually having to add additional soil amendment purely for the purposes of improving soil quality. So we wanted to be reasonably comprehensive in terms of the cost and benefits that we were evaluating. As you see from this summary table, this is per increment of 1,000 dry tons. And you'll see that landfill is quite cheap relative to the others methods that we looked at. Conversion to Class AA, which again is in effect a composting and blending operation. Additional materials need to be brought in for that blending. And as it turned out, that was the most costly approach. On the benefit side of things, land application is the cheapest, while the benefits, because of some of the byproducts that I just mentioned, such as ammonia and phosphorus recovery, the Cedron Varcor, which is vapor recompression and distillation technology, yields probably the highest benefits, although those data are a little bit outdated and need to be brought up to current snuff, especially based on the proposed operating facility in Indiantown, which is under construction. I wanted to highlight the benefit cost ratio. All of them, at least based on the data we looked at, are under 1, meaning none of these yield benefits to society directly. We're handling waste. It is a societal cost at the end of the day that we all contribute to. However, clearly there are less effective or less economically efficient means, and there are more economically efficient means. And land application fares quite poorly when we look at the benefit cost ratio. Again, this is for Class B. And then we look at the ratios, you could see in the rightmost column that the vapor recompression and distillation technology yields the highest ratio. It's basically the inverse of that benefit cost. It's relative to land application if we look at that as the individual metric. So this may factor into utilities and counties' choices as to which means of managing their waste may be more cost effective in the long run, and to begin to think about might optimizing a mix of these or shifting to one entirely may be in a particular county's best interest. Lisa, I'll turn this back over to you.
Sure. We partnered with the Public Trust for Conservation to bring on the Balmoral Group to do an economic study just of the upper basin of the St. Johns River and release this report we'll share with you all in 2025. and really wanted to look at what those cleanup cost liability would be from this transfer of pollution that's generated outside of the watershed that's transferred into the watershed. And they found that there'll be more than $1 billion in public funding to offset the impact of pollution that's being transferred. This study just looked at nutrient pollution. It did not look at other impacts that we discussed today, like forever chemicals, as well as other hormones and pharmaceuticals and things that are happening. And it didn't take into consideration looking at the devaluation or contamination of our agricultural lands in the Upper Basin, which are so important to the counties there. And you may ask, well, who pays this $1 billion? And it is coming from public funding. There will have to be some attempt to offset this damage, because as we mentioned earlier and show you that all the data from the agencies are showing significant pollution issues resulting from the disposal of biosolids in the upper basin of the St. Johns.
Okay. In the interest of time, because I know we're getting towards the end of our presentation, I wanted to provide a recap. Just wanted to make sure everyone understands this is a problem that is not shrinking. The problem is continuing to grow. We don't track everything that we think needs to be tracked as well as we should. So there's more data that needs to be incorporated. So we pointed this out as a research consideration. And want to emphasize to you again, we mentioned early on that Class AA biosolids, the larger share of what is being produced and moved about the state, isn't being tracked with any sort of a manifest system as the permitting process for Class B. So that results in, I won't say misinformation, but it's information that doesn't allow us to make the best choices about where this material should go. Despite being treated, biosolids, all the classes we mentioned, A, B, AA, A, B, and AQ, they are not free, 100% pure of any contamination. And the concern about PFOS and PFOS is continuing to increase as we learn more about that. We mentioned that there is a statistically significant nexus between the amount of land applied biosolids and impairment. We noted for you that there's a lot of missing information on groundwater that may be very critical, especially as we see these areas in headwaters or areas that may be contributing to springs and spring sheds and the like throughout the state. So, and we're only really at the beginning of understanding the impacts on surface waters. When we are looking at the economics, the pricing of biosolids, which is incorporated into every user's utility fees, does not address the environmental externalities, those imposed societal costs that Lisa referred to in the Balmoral Group study that can be reasonably attributable to the land application of Class B biosolids. So there aren't any direct out-of-pocket costs for the transportation, other than maybe captured through the utility billing and any fees for wastewater services conducted at the utility level. So all those other costs, whether it's planning and the developing of BMAPs and any remediation expenditures that are incurred by the agencies such as DEP or the Water Management District, these are all paid indirectly by all of us at large, whether it's through general revenues or potentially through the Water Management District's ad valorem and or other fees, other financial resources that they have at their disposal. But it's not borne by the user or by the producers directly. In terms of the cost benefit work, again, of the predominant of scalable means of treatment at this point in time that we're familiar with, that vapor recompression and distillation appears to be most cost effective, although additional data is needed. That's to be followed by some other, I didn't get into it here, advanced measures of composting that use some proprietary bacterial approaches that are pretty successful at reducing or sequestering the nutrients that would then leach out into groundwater or surface waters. So those are worth looking at. We've seen lots of people always interested in waste energy options, which has been used, but it's used very, very, very narrowly in Florida. The capital costs for doing this are very high, and it does present a problem of local impacts in terms of air quality. And there's a lot of social and environmental trade-offs that need to be considered if waste energy options were to be explored in earnest. So again, more research needs are there in terms of collecting more current data, compliance with reporting requirements and the like. That's very mixed. So we could use better information as to what's expected to be reported. Again, I mentioned the cost and benefits for all these, and some research into the fee structures that may be useful for transferring or shifting some of the societal cost onto the producers. We want to understand better, following up, say, on the work of the St. Johns River Water Management District, which has not been replicated by the other WMDs, on the export of nutrients from a range of the sites receiving Class B. They looked at their particular area, their watershed, whether it's rainfall patterns, soil considerations, and the like. We certainly would want to understand more about other parts of the state where this occurs and be able to come up with a more comprehensive approach that would allow us to do better work thinking about how BMPs need to be tailored or reconsidered with respect to the application not only of Class B, but Class AA, which is distributed all over Florida's landscape. So we have strong recommendations that we've shared with Riverkeeper and other advocacy partners on improving the monitoring program. Assessment of the EPA designated priority PFAS compounds that was done back in January. The idea that we need a single state agency or office that's going to coordinate and collaborate all this information for all the stakeholders involved in biosolids generation and distribution, not to ignore Class AA, and to make sure, because it is the dominant share of everything, that it is reflected in our understanding and regulation of biosolids, and to begin to look at the prospect of a fee or a surcharge for those that are exporting Class B biosolids. Again, we discussed the fact that there is a grant program. It would not be a crazy idea to go ahead and use fees or any type of surcharges attached to wastewater management in the state to support that program, to help with scaling up technologies that do a better job in managing risk, whether it's PFAS reduction or nutrient sequestration. And the last consideration, following up on Lisa's slides about PFAS in particular, these are all long-term perspective and serious liability considerations, and the legislature probably really should not hide its head in the sand about that. Again, there's a number of other counties and states around the country that have made serious changes in their land application programs, driven primarily by PFAS presence and concern in agricultural products derived from these agricultural enterprises, whether it's meat, cattle, milk, and certainly vegetables. So it's something that warrants serious attention, because the potential cost to property owners or the state or the utilities may be quite large down the road. Here's our contact information if anyone has questions that don't get addressed through the chat box or through Paul's checklist of questions that have been handed in online already. So we again thank you for your time this morning. We appreciated the opportunity from FAC and ICG to present this information, and hope that we can look forward to your partnership in moving the needle further on something that we think is long past time to reevaluate and move that along. Thanks.
Yeah, Craig, Lisa, thank you. There is so much in this report. Even your executive summary and recommendations is fairly dense, and I went through it a couple of times. Let me stop there and see if there were any questions that Paul was tracking, or Chris, because it's hard for me to see on my monitor.
Sure, I'm not, Eric, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but I wonder, Craig or Lisa, Craig, you mentioned that some other states were driven by concerns about PFAS, were ahead of Florida in switching to different approaches for handling biosolids, moving away from land application. Could you follow up on that a little bit? Are there any specific examples, and how are they confronting the economics of this? There is a downstream economic impact, but at the front end, it is part of what makes this a challenging issue is you have essentially a free source of nutrients for farmers who might be interested in it. So how are some of the other states that are ahead of Florida navigating those challenges?
Lisa, you want to get started on that, if you would?
Actually, I cannot answer that question. I've just been tracking them getting away from it and transferring out and sharing the information that they've shared, especially in Texas, when you have cattle ranchers suing the EPA because they're having to euthanize cattle. So we've been tracking what they're doing as a way of demonstrating this is a really problematic economic as well as environmental issue. I see John November from the Public Trust for Conservation's off mute. John, can you share some light on what Maine or other states are doing?
Yeah, I can. My video is not working for some reason, but I was going to bring up Washington. In Washington, they gone have moved a little farther along and are actually have an operational Varcor technology from Cedron, and they are producing liquid nitrogen that is being sold on the open market and reducing PFAS all at the same time. And it's been stated to me that the Indiantown facility could be expanded to other regional facilities around the state of Florida, and the private sector may be able to come in and partner with public and county entities to solve this problem without much upfront investment from counties. So there's exciting opportunities for the private sector to help municipalities and counties solve this very challenging problem, and certainly something that needs further attention.
I'll go ahead and add back to Paul's question. So there were a handful of states. Maine led the way, I believe. And again, the report summarizes a handful of these because it's still ongoing, and tried to remain as current as it could through this spring on legal activities that were being undertaken at state or county level. And it was less so the issue that folks were coming up with a strategy to solve the problem, as opposed to put our hands up and say no more. So in Maine banned it. There were concerns that this stuff was affecting the state's agricultural image as well as public health. So it was then left up to the generators to basically come up with their own solutions. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure what those solutions were, other than that land application was no longer going to be in the mix.
And
New York State.
That does now include compost. So before it was just Class B biosolids, but right now Maine is in the process of considering doing additional restrictions on compost, which is something that's probably going to be growing over time, as well as concerns over PFAS emerge.
And if I
Right.
could just go back to John mentioned Indiantown, and we did not include that in our presentation, but I think it's important. Martin County actually has a facility that's being built with private investment that will handle, once it's operational, about 2/3, I believe it is, of the amount of biosolids that are being transferred to the headwaters. So it will do a significant amount. It is a pilot project. And I think that's a wonderful thing for counties that are concerned about this, whether you're receiving or sending this material. But that project it's being built in Martin County.
Right. And we did collaborate closely with the Cedron company over the course of the project. Again, we had older data from them regarding the cost, operational side and capital cost, and the current cost considerations of the Indiantown facility they were not in a position to go ahead and share those for us to go ahead and update the cost benefit analysis to reflect the Florida project in particular. But it's still an indicator, because those numbers were based on their much smaller projects elsewhere nationally, both in Washington State and Indiana, as well as in Africa, if I'm not mistaken. So there was something to go on. And of course, as things scale up, the economics can change, hopefully for the better and not for the worse. But we'll know more once that thing is up and running. But again, a number of states have instituted bans. The outcome of that remains to be seen in terms of how it all plays out. I know in Maine there was some pushback to get the legislature to reconsider the ban that had been imposed, but I don't think it was successful. But folks are grappling with this again. The PFAS liability issue is potentially huge. A lot of people don't get all that excited about, well, there's a 10% increase in phosphorates in our water bodies. Do we even know it's necessarily from biosolids or something else? And what's the cost of cleaning it up? Or does it affect property value? Is it going to create another algal bloom next spring? Those things are a bit more hit and miss. But when you start getting into individual public health, whether it's drinking water wells or human exposure to those doing the application, and to Lisa's point, well, it's showing up in food products, then everyone's affected. And it's something that becomes a focal point or a fulcrum for folk to start thinking about how do we need to regulate and manage this product differently because of that consideration more than any other.
So Craig, from a scientific standpoint, were PFAS, was that not being tracked in biosolids historically? Is that why it's gotten so much attention, particularly in Texas and I guess in some other places as well?
Yes, again, as I highlighted at the beginning, the initial federal regulations going back to the early 1990s on biosolids, which was, now a euphemism because it was something that was recyclable and we're closing the loop and doing all these great things. As Paul said, it's still a resource. It's got organic content, nutrients have value, from an agronomic perspective. So this all seemed like a great idea. And the only consideration given at that time and continuing here decades later was for pathogens. Are people going to get directly sick from bacteria or viruses? Heavy metals, because EPA has always been focused on heavy metal, lead in our waters and the like, again, from a public health perspective. From the environmental perspective, the impact on surface waters and groundwaters and dependent ecosystems was never part of the regulatory framework for understanding any of this. And no one was paying any attention to PFAS, certainly in the early days. And it was only as we became more aware of it that it's there, are folk looking at it, but none of the regulations stipulate that PFAS specifically be monitored in biosolids. As I said, it is monitored now in drinking water, and the standards were ratcheted down dramatically back this past January, and it's a challenge for some utilities to go do that. So they have to monitor. But at the back end of the process, where all those domestic and potentially commercial and industrial sources are contributing PFAS and other contaminants of emerging concern, that's not being dealt with because there are no requirements yet to do so. So no monitoring and no understanding, and then no response because we've got nothing to base it on at this point in time. So we do ask that be looked at.
That ultimately that might be the trigger, because that certainly has the attention of elected officials that I see and work with at the national level. I mean, when we discuss PFAS at our conferences, this is a big issue.
We understand that it is a potentially powerful fulcrum to begin thinking about what to do. So if you're monitoring for that, you can start monitoring for the other things as well, and using that to help guide how a monitoring framework should be established.
And
So
just
can we go
and
ahead?
if I can just
Lisa?
remind people, this is being literally trucked. And so if you could test for PFAS before it's spread on land, before it gets out of that truck, or ideally before it's put in the truck to save cost as well. But I mean, I think this would really demonstrate the unsustainability of this practice and the potential harm to the receiving counties.
So can we talk about that a little bit?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, Craig, I didn't want to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that notion of the incentives program and the grant program that actually John had a significant role in helping get into the legislation back in 2023, tying together with the point Lisa just made, there's no reason why funding through the biosolids generators couldn't be dedicated towards research on how to minimize or sequester PFAS in biosolids that may end up being distributed as Class B or Class AA for that matter. Again, separate from Cedron's approach, which may isolate it well. I remember speaking with Harvest Quest in particular as one of a couple of these more advanced composting technologies that can document that their approaches, again, proprietary bacterial inoculants are helpful in reducing or sequestering nutrients as well as PFAS, but not eliminating it entirely. So, there's some tools at our disposal to begin to reduce the risk, but we should, we need a way to go ahead and fund that, and a generator fee or surcharge of some sort to support that work to be coordinated through presumably DEP at the state level, and maybe in conjunction with the universities would be a nice tool in the toolbox to again keep the focus on this and hopefully make progress.
So can we talk a little bit about just the county role in land use? Because that's I'm going to put on my land use planner hat. And I guess in the early days, Craig, as you were sort of alluding to, that this sounded like the land application of biosolids. It generally sounded maybe this was a way to deal with the waste product over time, but more research has come out, and as you talk about, if I am a county that receives this, what disincentives are there, or what incentives exist to allow this to happen? Why would this be an allowable use in my county? Why would I want to have this come up into my community, notwithstanding private property rights and what have you?
Well, I think that point is the ticket, because ultimately these decisions weren't made by the counties. They were made by individual agricultural enterprises that were willing to take effectively a free product. Again, the transport costs, to the best of my knowledge, are all paid for by the utilities doing the initial transfer. So the only cost imposed on the recipients were storage and their ultimate spreading mechanics. So there's a cost for that, which they would have incurred anyway if they were simply buying other sorts of non-biosolids based compost or their own synthetic fertilizers and related chemicals that they would have been applying on largely improved pasture. So to the extent that those costs weren't being incurred and it was being substituted by biosolids, the cost to the end user was effectively nominal. So in that sense, it was a good deal. The urban counties got to get rid of something that they had no immediate direct use for. At that point when all this began, most of it was Class B. Class AA was the minority end product. It was a higher end thing. It was more costly. It was, the type of thing that would be used, and distributed through, home improvement stores and the like, much less so in the broad agricultural arena, except some was being used in citrus, and the nurseries and specialty crops may have been using it too. So it was a higher end product for a higher valued agronomic enterprise. But again, that landscape has shifted. So again, in terms of, there was no real interest or point of access for the counties themselves to be decision makers in this, as long as that land use was agricultural. And to the private property rights issue, it was the owners and farm enterprise operators' own internal decisions whether this was the right thing to go ahead and bring onto their land. And again, there was no downside from a regulatory perspective other than going through the permitting process, which was not really all that onerous. And and people presumably comported with the limits of how much application was going to be allowed on a particular site, the density or total volume that was being applied, and that was pretty much it.
So has any county banned the land application?
Yes, so the legislature, as Craig mentioned, made the decision for everyone on this in 2007. However, Indian River County, they did pass a moratorium banning all biosolids applications, as well as Brevard County. They passed a moratorium on any new application sites. Those two are grandfathered in, but the 2020 Clean Waterways Act preempted any other counties for taking action.
So what are the utilities now doing?
The utilities in which part of the state?
So the generators.
The generators?
If
I mean, there's
I have
still
fewer places to go, I'm going to have to do something differently. Right.
There are not that many fewer places to go. The shortchanging of that for those particular two counties, they were in the list of folks receiving, but they're not the dominant recipients, as we noted in those charts. So the avenues are still wide open for a lot of material to be trucked, and there are a lot of other areas of the state where no one's really paying a whole lot of attention. Here we've got Lisa and St. Johns River River Keeper, focusing on the counties within their geography, and highlighting the complications that have occurred, especially given the dominance of where the stuff is going, which at the end of the day was a simple economic decision for the South Florida counties because they were closest. They were just over the water management district line or the Okeechobee Basin line. That was as close as you can get. You had acres and acres and acres of improved pasture that could take advantage of this. Shipping it up to Levy County or Gulf County or wherever it's going was going to be economically implausible. Although if say the upper St. Johns River Basin became less friendly, whether just for water quality constraints or a ban, if that were the case, as long as there was Class B not being converted to something not being otherwise regulated, the cost for shipping would just simply go up and it would go somewhere else.
And I do.
Again, landfilling is always an option, but landfilling doesn't work because, as any county knows, landfill space is at a premium. You want it for MSW, municipal solid waste. Biosolids are used for part of the daily cover in most locations, but that's a small percentage of what's being generated. And just to simply actually put it in the landfill takes up that space that would be much more valuable for municipal refuse.
And I just want to underscore the fact that we need a statewide solution. We don't want to fix just the upper basin just to move this problem somewhere else. The state of Florida has known this is a problem since the Northern Everglades Act was passed in 2007. And here we are in 2025. And as Craig pointed out, it's a growing problem because we're continuing to grow at a significant rate. In Florida, we need to do something about it collectively. And that's why it's so important for this conversation with the counties, because we think it needs to be a statewide solution that's really long-term and sustainable for all counties in the state of Florida.
Yeah, I love Lisa's point to that, which is why we're looking at the legislature as a whole. And, I can only reflect back on the dairy industries that were moved out of Dade and moved up to the Okeechobee Basin. It became a problem there for Lake Okeechobee and downstream. And then eventually all those cows got moved up to the Swanee Basin where that problem persists there now. So, shifting it around doesn't solve it. We do need a much more targeted and focused solution or set of solutions that deals with this at the statewide level. It's really the only equitable way to go ahead and do it.
Well, everyone, this is a great webinar. This is a great report, Paul. What's next? I know you have recommendations that are in there that will probably be offered to the legislature, but is there any follow-up to the study itself?
No, we are going to be speaking and partnering with Lisa's organization on this, with both local decision makers and state decision makers to try to get some traction for these recommendations. And we do not have the funding at this point to expand on or extend the report, but we've got plenty of information to work with. And hopefully, as everybody in the counties understands, the advocacy process can move slowly, but we will be working at both the local and the state levels and welcoming any opportunities to speak to decision makers at those levels to try to get some action on these recommendations.
The report was originally titled something along the line of being a basis for management discussions. So here we are now. There's a lot of information that just wasn't known. So it's all been kind of assembled in one place for a variety of stakeholders to take a look at. We more than welcome any comments, questions, revisions, or what did you do wrong? And that's great, so that we don't misrepresent anything to the legislature or to officials and other stakeholders. But we do need to have the discussion and do something with it. We didn't want this to sit. It was my understanding that the regional planning councils back in 2018 or 2019 almost uniformly adopted resolutions to act on this. those are the RPCs, and they didn't really have any regulatory authority, but it was a public statement on behalf of all the counties that participate in those, that something needs to be done. And this seems an appropriate time, as we pointed out. Here we are 5 years after the legislature looked at this in earnest last time, and now we've got DEP sidestepping the law to a small degree and just letting this proceed when it seems like the time is right to at least move the needle somehow, or get the discussion back in front of folks that need to have it.
And I would just add too, Eric, we are more than happy to meet with anyone on the call, whether it's in your commission room or one-on-one. It's real important for us to get this information out there, get feedback in any way we can partner with FAC, the counties, in any way, because it's going to take a statewide solution to figure our path forward.
I agree. We look forward to working with you guys, and thank you for reaching out. Thanks for your partnership.